Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're reading again today from Dickens' Stories About Children, and today our story is Pip for short. My father's family name being Pirrip, and my Christian name being Philip, my infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip, and came to be called Pip. I give Pirrip as my father's family name on the authority of his tombstone and my sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, who married the blacksmith. As I never saw my father or my mother and never saw any likeness of either of them, for their days were long before the days of photographs, my first fancies regarding what they were like were unreasonably derived from their tombstones. The shape of the letters on my father's gave me an odd idea that he was a square, stout, dark man with curly black hair. From the character and turn of the inscription, also Georgiana, wife of the above, I drew a childish conclusion that my mother was freckled and sickly. Ours was the marsh country down by the river, within, as the river wound, 20 miles of the sea. My first distinct impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable, raw, damp afternoon toward evening. At such a time, I found out for certain that this bleak place overgrown with nettles was the churchyard, and that Tobias Pirrip, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried, and that the dark, flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dikes and mounds and gates, with scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes, and that the low leaden line beyond was the river, and that the distant savage lair from which the wind was rushing was the sea, and that the small bundle of shivers, growing afraid of it all and beginning to cry, was Pip. "Hold your noise!" cried a terrible voice, as a man started up from among the graves at the side of the church porch. "Hold your noise, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat." A fearful man, all in gray, with a great iron on his leg, a man with no hat, and broken shoes, and an old rag tied round his head. A man who had been soaked in water and smothered in mud and lamed by stones and cut by flints and stung by nettles and torn by briars, who limped and shivered and glared and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. "Don't cut my throat, sir," I pleaded in terror. "Pray don't do it, sir." "Tell us your name," said the man. "Quick." "Pip, sir." "Once more," said the man. "Give it mouth." "Pip, Pip, sir." "Show us where you live," said the man. "Point out the place." I pointed to where a village lay on the flat inshore among the alder trees and pollards, a mile or more from the church. The man, after looking at me for a moment, turned me upside down and emptied my pockets. There was nothing in them but a piece of bread. When the church came to itself, for he was so sudden and strong that he made it go head over heels before me, and I saw the steeple under my legs. When the church came to itself, I say, I was seated on a high tombstone trembling, while he ate the bread ravenously. "You young dog," said the man, licking his lips at me, "what fat cheeks you have got." I believe they were fat, though I was at that time undersized for my years and not strong. "Damned if I couldn't eat 'em," said the man, with a threatening shake of his head, "and if I hadn't half a mind to it." I earnestly expressed my hope that he wouldn't, and held tighter to the tombstone on which he had put me, partly to keep myself upon it, partly to keep myself from crying. "Now then, looky here," said the man. "Where's your mother?" "There, sir," said I. He started, made a short run, and stopped and looked over his shoulder. "There, sir," I timidly explained. "Also Georgiana. That's my mother." "Oh-ho," said he, coming back. "And is that your father along of your mother?" "Yes, sir," said I. "Him, too, late of this parish." "Ha," he muttered then, considering. "Who do you live with, supposing you're kindly let to live, which I haven't made up my mind about?" "My sister, sir, Mrs. Joe Gargery, wife of Joe Gargery the blacksmith, sir." "Blacksmith, eh?" said he, and looked down at his leg. After darkly looking at his leg and at me several times, he came closer to my tombstone, took me by both arms, and tilted me back as far as he could hold me, so that his eyes looked most powerfully down into mine, and mine looked most helplessly up into his. "Now looky here," he said, "the question being whether you're to be let to live. You know what a file is?" "Yes, sir." "And you know what whittles is?" "Yes, sir." After each question, he tilted me over a little more, so as to give me a greater sense of helplessness and danger. "You get me a file." He tilted me again. "And you get me whittles." He tilted me again. "You bring 'em both to me." He tilted me again. "Or I'll have your heart and liver out." He tilted me again. I was dreadfully frightened and so giddy that I clung to him with both hands and said, "If you would kindly please to let me keep upright, sir, perhaps I shouldn't be sick and perhaps I could attend more." He gave me a most tremendous dip and roll so that the church jumped over in its own weathercock. Then he held me by the arms in an upright position on the top of the stone and went on in these fearful terms. "You bring me tomorrow morning early that file and them whittles. You bring the lot to me at that old battery over yonder. You do this, and you never dare to say a word or dare to make a sign concerning your haven't seen such a person as me, or any person, and you shall be let to live. Now, what do you say?" I said that I would get him the file, and I would get him what broken bits of food I could, and I would come to him at the battery early in the morning. "Say, Lord, strike you dead if you don't," said the man. I said so, and he took me down. "Now," he pursued, "you remember what you've undertook, and you get home." Good night, sir," I faltered. "Much of that," said he, glancing about him over the cold, wet flat. "I wish I was a frog or an eel." At the same time, he hugged his shuddering body in both his arms, clasping himself as if to hold himself together, and limped toward the low church wall. When he reached it, he got over it like a man whose legs were numbed and stiff, and then turned round to look for me. When I saw him turning, I set my face toward home and made the best use of my legs. But presently I looked over my shoulder and saw him going on again toward the river, still hugging himself in both arms, and picking his way with his sore feet among the great stones dropped into the marshes here and there, for stepping places where the rains were heavy or the tide was in. The marshes were just a long black horizontal line then as I stopped to look after him, and the river was just another horizontal line, not nearly so broad nor yet so black, and the sky was just a row of long angry red lines and dense black lines intermixed. On the edge of the river I could faintly make out the only two black things in all the prospect that seemed to be standing upright. One of these was the beacon by which the sailors steered like an unhooped cask upon a pole, an ugly, slimy thing when you were near it. The other, a gibbet with some chains hanging to it, which had once held a pirate. The man was limping on toward this latter, as if he were the pirate coming to life and come down, and going back to hook himself up again. It gave me a terrible turn when I thought so, and as I saw the black cattle lifting their heads to gaze after him, I wondered whether they thought so too. I looked all around for the horrible young man and could see no signs of him, but now I was frightened again and ran home without stopping. Chapter 2. My sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, was more than 20 years older than I, and had established a great reputation with herself and the neighbors because she had brought me up by hand. Having at that time to find out for myself what the expression meant, and knowing her to have a hard and heavy hand, and to be much in the habit of laying it upon her husband as well as upon me, I supposed that Joe Gargery and I were both brought up by hand. She was not a good-looking woman, my sister, and I had a general impression that she must have made Joe Gargery marry her by hand. Joe was a fair man with curls of flaxen hair on each side of his smooth face and eyes of such a very undecided blue that they seemed to have somehow got mixed with their own whites. He was a mild, good-natured, sweet-tempered, easy-going, foolish, dear fellow, a sort of Hercules in strength and also in weakness. My sister, Mrs. Joe, with black hair and eyes, had such a prevailing redness of skin that I sometimes used to wonder whether it was possible she washed herself with a nutmeg grater instead of soap. She was tall and bony and almost always wore a coarse apron fastened over her figure behind with two loops, and having a square impregnable bit in front that was stuck full of pins and needles. She made it a powerful merit in herself and a strong reproach against Joe that she wore this apron so much, though I really see no reason now why she should have worn it at all, or why, if she did wear it at all, she should not have taken it off every day of her life. Joe's forge adjoined our house, which was a wooden house, as many of the dwellings in our country were, most of them at that time. When I ran home from the churchyard, the forge was shut up, and Joe was sitting alone in the kitchen. Joe and I being fellow sufferers and having confidence and such, Joe imparted a confidence to me the moment I raised the latch of the door and peeped in at him opposite to it, sitting in the chimney corner. "Mrs. Joe has been out a dozen times looking for you, Pip, and she's out now making it a baker's dozen." "Is she?" "Yes, Pip," said Joe, "and what's worse, she's got Tickler with her." At this dismal intelligence I twisted the only button on my waistcoat round and round, and looked in great depression at the fire. Tickler was a wax-ended piece of cane, worn smooth by collision with my tickled frame. "She sat down," said Joe, "and she got up and she made a grab at Tickler and she rampaged out." "That's what she did," said Joe, slowly clearing the fire between the bars with the poker. "She rampaged out, Pip." Has she been gone long, Joe? I always treated him as a larger species of child, and as no more than my equal. Well, said Joe, looking up at the Dutch clock, she's been on the rampage this last spell about 5 minutes, Pip. She's a-coming. Get behind the door, old chap, and have the jack-towel betwixt you. I took the advice. My sister, Mrs. Joe, throwing the door wide open and finding an obstruction behind it, immediately divined the cause and applied Tickler to further investigation. Then Joe, glad to get hold of me on any terms, passed me on into the chimney and fenced me there with his great legs. Where have you been, you young monkey? Asked Mrs. Joe, stamping her foot. Tell me directly what you've been doing to wear me away with fret and fright and worrit, or I'd have you out of that corner if you was 50 pips and he was 500 gargeries. I've only been to the churchyard, said I from my stool, crying and rubbing myself. Churchyard, repeated my sister. If it weren't for me, you'd have been to the churchyard long ago and stayed there. Who brought you up by hand? You did, said I. And why did I do it, I should like to know, exclaimed my sister. I whimpered, I don't know. I don't, said my sister. I'd never do it again, I know that. I may truly say I've never had this apron of mine off since born you were. It's bad enough to be a blacksmith's wife, and him a Gargery, without being your mother. My thoughts strayed from that question as I looked disconsolately at the fire. For the fugitive out on the marshes with the iron leg, the file, the victuals, and the dreadful pledge I was under to commit a larceny on those sheltering premises rose before me in the avenging coals. Ha, said Mrs. Joe, restoring Tickler to his station. Churchyard indeed. You may well say churchyard, you two. One of us, by the by, had not said it at all. You'll drive me to the churchyard betwixt you one of these days, and oh, a precious pair you'd be without me. As she applied herself to set the tea things, Joe peeped down at me over his leg, as if he were mentally casting me and himself up, and calculating what kind of pair we practically should make under the grievous circumstances foreshadowed. After that, he sat feeling his right side flaxen curls and whisker, and following Mrs. Joe about with his blue eyes, as his manner always was at squally times. My sister had a trenchant way of cutting our bread and butter for us that never varied. First, with her left hand, she held the loaf hard and fast against her bib, where it sometimes got a pin into it and sometimes a needle, which we afterward got into our mouths. Then she took some butter, not too much, on a knife and spread it on the loaf in an apothecary's kind of way, as if she were making a plaster, using both sides of the knife with a slapping dexterity and trimming and molding the butter off round the crust. Then she gave the knife a final smart swipe on the edge of the plaster, and then sawed a very thick round off the loaf, which she finally, before separating from the loaf, hewed into two halves, of which Joe got one, and I the other. On the present occasion, though I was hungry, I dared not eat my slice. I felt that I must have something in reserve for my dreadful acquaintance. I knew Mrs. Joe's housekeeping to be of the strictest kind, and that my larcenous researches in the dead of night might find nothing available in the safe. Therefore, I resolved to put my hunk of bread and butter down in the leg of my trousers. The effort of resolution necessary to the achievement of this purpose I found to be quite awful. It was as if I had to make up my mind to leap from the top of a high house or plunge into a great depth of water, and it was made the more difficult by the unconscious Joe. In our above-mentioned freemasonry as fellow-sufferers, and in his good-natured companionship with me, it was our evening habit to compare the way we bit through our slices by silently holding them up to each other's admiration now and then, which in general led us to new exertions. Tonight, Joe several times invited me by the display of his fast diminishing slice to enter upon our usual friendly competition, but he found me each time with my yellow mug of tea on one knee and my untouched bread and butter on the other. At last, I desperately considered that the thing I contemplated must be done, and that it had best be done in the least improbable manner consistent with the circumstances. I took advantage of a moment when Joe had just looked aside and got my bread and butter down my leg. Conscience is a dreadful thing when it accuses man or boy, but when, in the case of a boy, that secret burden cooperates with another secret burden down the leg of his trousers, it is, as I can testify, a great punishment. The guilty knowledge that I was going to rob Mrs. Joe — I never thought I was going to rob Joe, for I never thought of any of the housekeeping property as his — united to the necessity of always keeping one hand on the bread and butter as I sat, or when I was ordered about the kitchen on any small errand, almost drove me out of my mind. Then, as the March winds made the fire glow and flare, I thought I heard the fierce voice outside of the man with the iron on his leg, who had sworn me to secrecy, declaring that he couldn't and wouldn't starve until tomorrow, but must be fed now. If ever anybody's hair stood on end with terror, mine must have done so then. But perhaps nobody's ever did? It was Christmas Eve, and I had to stir the pudding for next day with the copper stick from 7 to 8 by the Dutch clock. I tried it with the load upon my leg, and that made me think afresh of the man with the iron on his leg, and found the tendency of exercise to bring the bread and butter out at my ankle quite unmanageable and unconquerable. Happily, I slipped away and deposited that part of my conscience in my garret bedroom. "Hark!" said I, when I had done my stirring, and was taking a final warm in the chimney corner before being sent up to bed. "Was that guns, Joe?" "Ah," said Joe, "that's another convict off." "What does that mean, Joe?" said I. Mrs. Joe, who always took explanations upon herself, said snappishly, "Escaped! Escaped!" While Mrs. Joe sat with her head bending over her needlework, I put my mouth into the forms of saying to Joe, "What's a convict?" Joe put his mouth into the forms of returning such a highly elaborate answer that I could make out nothing of it but the single word "pip." "There was one off last night," said Joe aloud, "after sunset gun, and they fired warning of him, and now it appears they're firing warning of another." "Who's firing?" said I. "Drat that child," interposed my sister, frowning at me over her work. "What a questioner he is! Ask no questions, and you'll be told no lies." It was not very polite to herself, I thought, to imply that I should be told lies by her, even if I did ask questions. But she never was polite unless there was company. At this point, Joe greatly augmented my curiosity by taking the utmost pains to open his mouth very wide and put it into the form of a word that looked to me like sulks. Therefore, I naturally pointed to Mrs. Joe and put my mouth into the form of saying, "Her?" But Joe wouldn't hear of that at all, and again opened his mouth very wide and shook the form of a most emphatic word out of it. But I could make nothing of the word. "Mrs. Joe," said I as a last resource, "I should like to know if you wouldn't much mind where the firing comes from?" "Lord bless the boy!" exclaimed my sister, as if she didn't quite mean that, but rather the contrary. "From the hulks." "Oh-ho," said I, looking at Joe. "Hulks." Joe gave a reproachful cough, as much as to say, "I told you so." "And please, what's hulks?" "That's the way with this boy," exclaimed my sister, pointing me out with her needle and thread and shaking her head. "Answer him one question, and he'll ask you a dozen directly. Hulks are prison ships right across the meshes." We always use that name for marshes in our country. "I wonder who's put into prison ships and why they're put there," said I in a general way and with desperation. It was too much for Mrs. Joe, who immediately rose. "I tell you what, young man," said she, "I didn't bring you up by hand to badger people's lives out. It would be blame to me and not praise if I had. People are put in the hulks because they murder and because they rob and do all sorts of bad, and they almost always begin by asking questions. Now you get along to bed." If I slept at all that night, it was only to imagine myself drifting down the river on a short spring tide to the hulks. I was afraid to sleep, even if I had been inclined, for I knew that at the first faint dawn of morning I must rob the pantry. There was no getting a light by easy friction then. To have got one, I must have struck it out of flint and steel, and have made a great noise. As soon as the great black velvet pall outside my little window was shot with gray, I got up and went downstairs. Every board upon the way, and every crack in every board, calling after me, "Stop, thief!" and "Get up, Mrs. Joe." In the pantry, which was far more abundantly supplied than usual, owing to the season, I was very much alarmed by a hare hanging up by the heels, whom I rather thought I caught when my back was half turned, waking. I had no time for verification, no time for selection, no time for anything, for I had no time to spare. I stole some bread, some rind of cheese, about half a jar of mincemeat, which I tied up in my pocket handkerchief with my last night's slice, some brandy from a stone bottle, which I decanted into a glass bottle I had secretly used for making that intoxicating fluid, Spanish licorice water, up in my room, diluting the stone bottle from a jug in the kitchen cupboard, a meat bone with very little on it, and a beautiful round compact pork pie. I was nearly going away without the pie, but I was tempted to mount upon a shelf to look what it was that was put away so carefully in a covered earthenware dish in a corner, and I found it was the pie, and I took it in the hope that it was not intended for early use, and would not be missed for some time. There was a door in the kitchen communicating with the forge. I unlocked and unbolted that door and got a file from among Joe's tools. Then I put the fastenings as I had found them, opened the door at which I had entered when I ran home last night, shut it, and ran for the misty marshes. Chapter 3. It was a rimy morning and very damp. I had seen the damp lying on the outside of my little window as if some goblin had been crying there all night and using the window for a pocket handkerchief. Now I saw the damp lying on the bare hedges and spare grass like a coarser sort of spider's webs, hanging itself from twig to twig and blade to blade. On every rail and gate, wet lay clammy, and the marsh mist was so thick that the wooden finger on the post, directing people to our village, a direction which they never accepted, for they never came there, was invisible to me until I was quite close under it. Then, as I looked up at it while it dripped, it seemed to my oppressed conscience like a phantom devoting me to the hulks. The mist was heavier yet when I got out upon the marshes, so that instead of running at everything, everything seemed to run at me. This was very disagreeable to a quiet mind. The gates and dikes and banks came bursting at me through the mist, as if they cried as plainly as could be, "A boy with a pork pie! Stop him!" The black cattle came upon me with some like suddenness, staring out of their eyes and smoking out of their nostrils. "Hello, young thief!" One black ox with a white cravat on, who had to my awakened conscience something of a clerical air, fixed me so steadily with his eyes and moved his blunt head round in such an accusatory manner as I moved round that I called out to him, "I couldn't help it. It wasn't for myself I took it." Upon which he put down his head, blew a cloud of smoke out of his nose, and vanished with a kick up of his hind leg and flourish of his tail. All this time I was getting on toward the river, but however fast I went, I couldn't warm my feet, to which the damp cold seemed riveted, as the iron was riveted to the leg of the man I was running to meet. But I was soon at the battery, and there was the man hugging himself and limping to and fro, as if he had never all night left off hugging and limping, waiting for me. He was awfully cold, to be sure. I half expected to see him drop down before my face and die of cold. His eyes looked so awfully hungry, too, that when I handed him the file, it occurred to me that he would have tried to eat it if he had not seen my bundle. He did not turn me upside down this time to get at what I had, but left me right side upward while I opened the bundle and emptied my pockets. "What's in the bottle, boy?" said he. "Brandy," said I. He was already handing mincemeat down his throat in the most curious manner, more like a man who was putting it away somewhere in a violent hurry than a man who was eating it. But he left off to take some of the liquor, shivering all the while so violently that it was quite as much as he could do to keep the neck of the bottle between his teeth. "I think you have got the ague," said I. "I'm much of your opinion, boy," said he. "It's bad about here. You've been lying out in the meshes, and they're dreadful agueish, rheumatic, too." "I'll eat my breakfast afore they're the death of me," said he. "I'd do that if I was going to be strung up to that there gallows as there is over there directly arterward. I'll beat the shivers so far, I'll bet you a guinea." He was gobbling mincemeat, meat, bone, bread, cheese, and pork pie all at once, staring distrustfully while he did so at the mist all round us, and often even stopping his jaws, to listen. Some real or fancied sounds, some clink upon the river, or breathing of beasts upon the marsh, now gave him a start, and he suddenly said, "You're not a false imp? You brought no one with you?" "No, sir, no." "Nor give no one the office to follow you?" "No." "Well," said he, "I believe you. You'd be but a fierce young hound indeed, if at your time of life you could help to hunt a wretched varmint, hunted as near death and dunghill as this poor wretched varmint is." Something clicked in his throat, as if he had works in him like a clock and was going to strike, and he smeared his ragged rough sleeve over his eyes. Pitying his desolation and watching him as he gradually settled down to the pie, I made bold to say, "I am glad you enjoy it." "Did you speak?" "I said I was glad you enjoyed it." "Thankee, my boy, I do." I had often watched a large dog of ours eating his food, and I now noticed a decided similarity between the dog's way of eating and the man's. The man took strong, sharp, sudden bites, just like the dog. He swallowed, or rather snapped up, every mouthful too soon and too fast, and he looked sideways here and there while he ate, as if he thought there was danger of somebody's coming to take the pie away. He was altogether too unsettled in his mind over it to appreciate it comfortably, I thought, or to have anybody to dine with him without making a chop with his jaws at the visitor. In all of these particulars he was very like the dog. As soon as he had eaten, he was down on the rank wet grass, filing at his iron like a madman, and not minding me or minding his own leg, which had an old chafe upon it and was bloody, but which he handled as roughly as if it had no more feeling in it than the file. I was very much afraid of him again, now that he had worked himself into this fierce hurry, and I was likewise very much afraid of keeping away from home any longer. I told him I must go, but he took no notice, so I thought the best thing I could do was to slip off. The last I saw of him, his head was bent over his knee, and he was working hard at his fetter, muttering impatient imprecations at it and at his leg. The last I heard of him, I stopped in the midst to listen, and the file was still going. Pip reached home safely, and in time forgot his terrifying adventure. The convict was recaptured, but later escaped and made his way to Australia. In his gratitude to Pip, he sent back to England much of the fortune he had made, and by that means, Pip had the advantage of a fine education. This is from the book by Charles Dickens, Great Expectations. Thank you for listening. Next time we'll start with Paul and Florence Dombey. Bye-bye.